Hi, everyone. This is Edgar Elchar. I am a periodontist in New York City. And before I introduce myself, I want to welcome you to the webinar that is in collaboration between the AAP and the LifeNet Health Biologic. This presentation is prepared by myself and approved by AAP and LifeNet Health. I am, as I said, a periodontist in New York City. I'm a diplomat of the American Board of Periodontology. I am currently a clinical professor at UPenn. I do have my private practice in New York City, as I mentioned, and I was the former director of the postgraduate program at NYU. I've published a couple of books and wrote papers, and I have spent the last 25 years of my career studying Allograft. So with that, I want to really welcome you to this webinar that is going to discuss the Allograft and how you can maximize the use of it in your own practices. But before we start, this is a disclaimer by LifeNet Health. I would invite you to read it. And if it's not enough time, you can come back to it later on at your ease. So with that, let's start talking about the objectives of this webinar. And in this webinar, we're going to review the guided bone regeneration principles, review of bone graft material, allograft versus xenograft, and their clinical applications. But in reality, in dentistry, today or forever, there is three factors that guide dentistry: the implant dentistry, the aesthetic dentistry, and oral health. And since my webinar will be focused on implant dentistry, you can see that today, in order for us to place an implant, we have to think about it in the most aesthetic possible. So we are driven aesthetically for that. And when we say driven aesthetically, that means we are driven prosthetic. And in order to achieve that, sometimes we will require ridge augmentation, site preservation, sometimes soft tissue management, and all of that to achieve a good peri-implant health. And as you can see, even in everything that we talk about, there's always this trilogy that is making the dentistry of today. And you can see here the aesthetic and the health included with the implant dentistry. And to second what I said is, this is the kind of cases we are facing. This is the young lady. She's 24 years old when she presented. She had fallen on a bike when she was in her 11 years old, and she has fractured her two teeth. And with that, they have treated her with some root canal and reimplanted the teeth. And at that time, when she presented to me, she started having signs of infection and purulence. So, or this case where you can have a young patient that she had this replaced lateral with an implant back when she was 20, now she's 32. And you can see the malpositioning of the implant, how it led to a problem that is not only soft tissue, but also it is a hard tissue. As you can see, she has lost vertical height and as well as the soft tissue. So that's how challenging today dentistry is. And in order for us to achieve it, we need to go back to the trilogy. And in order for us to achieve it, we need the principles that can help us, along with the biomaterial, to achieve and execute this successfully. So let's talk about the biological fundamentals of bone regeneration, and then later on review the biomaterials. When we look at the wound healing first, you can see that the cardinal points for bone wound healing, as stated by Wikejo, they are starts with the blood clot, goes through a wound cleansing, tissue formation, tissue modeling, and remodeling, and all of that in the socket. As you can remember, Wikejo talked more about the periodontal wound healing, but they all been re-verified by Cardara Poli, but on top of it, you have a well-organized trabecular and cortical bone. Giuseppe Cardarapoli, not Daniel Cardarapoli, he's their brothers. Giuseppe, unfortunately, passed away too young, and he was a very dear friend. And with that leads us to the second component. How does bone regeneration work? And that is a fundamental study that was done by Schenk, Buser, and Dallin in Bern, University of Bern, and where they took beagle dogs and they created a U-shaped defect. And in them, they put those two screws on the side as a marker, and then you can see the Gore-Tex membrane. If you have trained like me in early 90s, I started my training in 93. You can see these are the screws for stabilization, and underneath they filled the defect with blood. So it goes back to the Wickeju blood clot formation. And now they did histology at 2 months. And as you can see in the histology very markedly, that there is this immature tissue, and that's before they called it the woven bone. But what's striking most is you can see they used a cell exclusivity membrane, the Gore-Tex, and you can see still that there was penetration of soft tissue. And you can see that the bone was coming from the walls of the defect, which later on we knew that the walls of the defect are very important, which we knew also in periodontics. And at 4 months, you can see the beginning of the trabeculation and that the maturity of that bone, but was not very well organized. And when we looked at it radiographically, the two bones that were coming from the walls have merged in the center. And that's in reality how we move to 6 months waiting for the wound healing. And in the sites where the space was not preserved, there was no bone regeneration whatsoever. So that led us to the 3 points. A successful bone regeneration has to create a space, the stabilization of the space, and the maintenance or the complete closure of the case. So these are the fundamentals that we have learned in bone regeneration. So the wound starts with the blood and the tissue form inside if we create the space and stabilize the space and maintain it by primary closure. So now the second part of it is within that space, there is the space maintainer, which is either bone, which creates an osteoconduction, or it can be osteoconduction, osteoinduction, or it can be of the autogenous, which is the osteogenesis. So these are the physiology of the bone, how the bone will act. So as I mentioned before, when I trained in 1993, there was autogenous bone, allograft, alloplast, and xenograft. And when we looked at the autogenous bone, there was the blocks. That's what we were training in the United States. And there was in Germany, Professor Curie talking about monocortical plates. In the allograft space, there was only the DFBBA. And if you remember the paper of Becker, that published in Journal of Perio in 1994, when he crafted DFDBA in the socket, actually he said it's impeding the healing, the natural healing of a socket. And that's, if you were in that era, you can see that we stopped grafting sockets until later on we learned more about it and the biomaterial have changed. So that was a very important thing. And then the alloplast, we had ceramics, we had the bioclast, calcium phosphate, calcium sulfate, and in the xenograft, we had only the coral. Then in the mid-90s, the bovine came about, the rest stayed the same. And in early 2000, this is when the processes got way improved and they were able to keep the mineralized bone, cortical and cancellous, started seeing some allograft in putty in different carrier. One of them was the collagen. And then we started having the bovine that stayed the same and the coral. So in the xeno, there's nothing changed. In the allograft, we started seeing a resurgence of a new product. And autogenous still the same. And then in 2010 and forward, we started seeing a lot of things coming up, the fibers, the monocortical plate, the 3D milled cancellous blocks. And in the xenograft space, we had the equinox and we had the porcine. And in the growth factors, we had PRP, PRF, PDGF, and recombined human BMP2. So you can see today we have all of this amount of biomaterials. I am going to focus on the allograft in particular, obviously, and I want to move on and I'm going to show you a case in that I treated. And one thing that I didn't mention in my bio is that I have served in the U.S. Army in the reserves, and I'm a retired major. And this case is very particular to me because this is when I did it before I got deployed in 2003. And that was how she presented. She was a German national living in the United States. She didn't want to do sinus lift. And when we extracted the canine, you can see that it had a true and true defect. And that you have to put yourself in the era of 2003. Huh? We didn't have anything at that time. And that just came about with the allograft in putty that had a collagen matrix and chips of cortical bone. And that's exactly what I used. It was frozen. We had to warm it up. And then I covered it with a resorbable collagen membrane and achieved primary closure. Again, the principles of bone regeneration. And that's at time 0. And now at 6 months, this is when I came back from my deployment. And we took a CBCT, and you can see the bone fill that took place. And I was able to clinically place the 3 implants. And against my will at that time, we connected natural to implant. But then later on, that tooth number 2 failed, and we replaced it with an implant. And that's a 22 years follow-up on that case. So if you look at it clinically, it's stable both from the soft tissue and from the structurally radiographically. That's another case where we had the canine fractured, and I went ahead and I placed an implant, and you can tell how old is the implant because of the mount of that particular brand that became later on Loxim. And we followed the Joseph Kahn principles where we put it within the confinement of the defect. And then I layered cancellous at first and cortical on top to create the volume and diminish the resorption. And then I covered it with a collagen membrane and I stabilized it with tack. So again, the principles of bone regeneration and primary closure. And when we went ahead to do the second stage, you can see the volume that was preserved. But the most important thing that I want to ask you to take a look at is the vessels inside the bone. That is fascinating as a view. And then we did the second stage, and then that is when it was finished. And that was a follow-up of 5 years. And then the patient has moved to Texas, and then I lost track of it. But you can see also the stability of the bone that is an allograft. So having said that, I have done studies, as I mentioned before, on the allograft, in particular in Paris, that I helped develop, that DBM, and published it in 2013. And the most important is the histology. I came from a school of NYU where at that time, histology was a big thing for us. But I want you to look at it. This is a beautiful piece of art because if you look at it here, you can see the filling up of the lacuna that is taking place. Even if you go further here, you can see these lacuna that are in the process of filling. You have these primary osteons. That means it's the formation, and that's in the middle of that residual bone. And here you can see the secondary osteon with all of the Haversian system that forms with it. And if you look at here at the bridging between the two pieces, and if you move further with that, you can see here, this is a residual that you can see the lacuna is in the process of filling. And this one, look at the line of deposition and also the activity of osteoclast, this is the ruffle border, and the deposition of osteoblast, as you can see it here. So you can see how active and phenomenal the allograft, because it turns over. So that brings me to the question, why do we end up with such activity in the allograft? Well, because it has two components to it. It is an osteoinductive and osteoconductive. The question is, how does it happen that it's an osteoinductive? Well, it is because of the organic component. And that is the interesting part of combining or protecting through the processes the organic component in it, which leads to the turnover and the inductivity of that allograft. Moving to the xenograft, let me, in a particular bovine, let's look at this case. This is a case that I did in my private practice in 1999. And down the line, this patient, you see them every 3 months, you build a relationship with them, and she has a chronic leukemia, a very interesting kind of leukemia, to say the least. And so she had developed cavities here, and we're not going to do anything. So we decided to take that tooth out. And when I took it out, as you can see, the xenograft is well evident here. I asked her if she allows me to do a core, and she did. And she knows how much I love teaching, basically. And you can see there is nothing wrong with that. You can see a well-formed bone all over it, a well-active bone, but you can see the residual, and that's 20 years later. 20 years later. And that brings us to the question, why? Well, because it doesn't matter what they call it, sintering or heating, because sintering and heating are different levels of temperature. One is to the melting point, one below the melting point. And I put for you here at the bottom the link that you can look at it to see the difference between sintering and heating. But nevertheless, both of them do one thing. It eliminates the organic component. That's very important in an animal source. And that's why it will turn only into an osteoconductor and capable of turnover. Now, why this is a problem? Because you can see this paper that came about, and they said that anytime you have an inflammation that happens around an implant, and you are in a grafted sinuses, for instance, in sites where they had a ceramic and they had the xenograft, this went to the entirety of the graft in the sinus that required for them to clean it up. And that's something, because of the amount small, I've seen it, and I'm going to show it to you in a case. I have an ENT who refers to me a lot. And as you're going to see in the later on, that we talk about a podcast. I have a podcast, and I have interviewed this prominent ENT at Weill Cornell. We work together a lot, and he sent me this case. And you can see here on the upper left that maxillary antrum. So they have a infection and evident clinically. So I removed that cylinder implant, and you can see that there was a infection, buildup at the neck of it that led to an inflammation. And once it went up and it reached the graft that it is, and it was a xenograft, it spread throughout the whole antrum. And now you can see we have a fistula. And when we opened under IV sedation, you can see the xenograft all around and this tissue that we had to scrape around. And I noticed that there was these fragments. And so I submit them for histology, and that's the report that came. It's a fungal aggregate and chronic sinusitis. So is the allograft the new golden standard? Well, I wrote an editorial on that where I said, yes, it is. It's time for us to change the terminology. And I got an answer from a dear friend, Dr. Mish, who wrote originally autogenous bone is the golden standard. So let me break it down. He said that you will see in a small regular defect as sockets and maxillary sinus, it works. It's confined. Allograft works great. But when you go to a more advanced vertical and horizontal, then you require a more product like autogenous bone because of their osteogenesis, osteoinduction, and osteoconduction. So for that, I'm going to show you this case. This is a patient that had a history of crestal sinus elevation, and it went into her sinus. She ended up with a sinus surgery. And when we talk about sinus surgery, I just want to warn you that when they go into the sinus, they remove the medial wall in order for them to clean the sinus, especially if they want to remove a foreign body from inside. So the colleague who treated her put a xenograft and with this non-resorbable membrane to create vertical height. That's why I warn you sometimes from listening to some courses that promote those kind of things. And now she ended up with a major infection. And we have two challenges. One is first of all, I want to go back to this. This is the medial wall, how it's been broken. And now, once we remove that totally infected and non-resorbable membrane, you have two perforations. One is here and one is there. So I do a buccal pedicle flap to seal it, and that's a very good thing to do the sockets with it. And now we let everything heal, but I still have the two issues. One is the perforation at the crest, and one is the lack of medial wall. So when you do these cases, and I have a YouTube surgery on how I do these things, you're more than happy to. You can go on my channel and you can see them. I do quite a bit of these. So you have to elevate the floor, and you're always going to have some kind of perforation. Today, with the new product Oragen Allograft, it's a putty with fibers, but has a viable cells in it, and it's very easily to contain. Here we did an allograft, mixture of cortical cancellous in 50-50, but the cancellous is small and large, half and half, and in the cortical part, small and large, half and half. And I put a resorbable collagen membrane to seal the perforation, and then that's at 9 months, at 6 months. And here we have well-contained volume preservation, and we were able to achieve a good bone regeneration. And we placed 2 tissue levels, and then down the line, those premolars failed, and then I went ahead and did 2 immediate implants in that site. So it was restored, and she moved. Her husband he was doing a residency of thoracic surgery, cardiothoracic surgery. They went to Massachusetts from General Mass for further fellowships. And then she keeps coming back, and she had some issues with the TMJ, and they sent her to an ENT. ENT told her to go back to me and see me. And you can see I took the scan, and you can see the good preservation of the bone over 5 years period, and even with the regular control. So that brings you to the answer for the golden standard. I don't have to say more than that. Now we're going to go further with another case to tap it all. And this is in the sockets. And when I wrote this paper about the sockets, I defined the sockets in 3 grades. Now, when you go in grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3, you can see, and you can read it at your own leisure. You can see, going back to this case, and here, when we look at this case, we can see that we have a vertical component and we have a horizontal component. So that goes back to the second part that he brought up, Dr. Mish, in it, that allograft cannot do these kind of things. So let's take a look at this case, and here you can see it more evidently, the loss of soft tissue. So here it belongs to grade 3, which a socket becomes a defect that requires a bone regeneration, guided bone regeneration. So the way I approached this case is we temporized her. I took the canine, I removed the abutment, and you will see how long this abutment. It's beautiful gold abutment. Now, the depth of it dictates you that the implant is too deep. That's a given. But to refine it without opening a flap is very difficult. So I said, let me leave it, let the soft tissue heal. I do a couple of cola plugs, and I just stabilize them. and I let it heal. Then brings me to that paper that I wrote where I introduced 3D printing, and I did it with my resident at that time and some of the faculty. And when we did it, is we used a medical grade titanium mesh, 100% allograft that we layered, and but the most important is we put in that paper how we manage the flap, how we manage the 3D printing. Now it's very easy to 3D print, but back you have to put your mind back in 2019 when this paper was printed, but it was accepted a year ago, a year ahead, and that, we started doing this in 2013. Really was very rudimentary at that time. So we print the site. This is where the implant that I told you about, I don't want to refine it because I'm going to take such a risk when I'm not being able to visualize, but you can appreciate the amount of vertical height loss here on the palatal and as well as on the buccal. So you can see this is a very advanced case. So that brings me to the second point about the allograft feasibility. So I wax the area like they do in orthodontic surgery. I trim my titanium mesh ahead of the game. We polish the edges of it. We autoclave it. And then we go back and we address the flap. I don't do vertical incision, and you can see it more in depth in that article. And there's another paper in January of 2020 that I wrote with one of my former residents, a very dear colleague now, Dr. Falah Pouria, about how to manage the flap and how to stretch it instead of cutting into it. And here we can expose the implant, and I refined it. As you can see, those implants, when they are integrated, they are bound to the bone. That's a hydroxyapatite. You can see how much bone has grown on it. And we put the titanium mesh. The way I do it is I stabilize it on the palate. I start layering. I put cortical on the titanium mesh, cancellous in the center, and cortical on the other side and on the top. And I fold back the titanium mesh and I stabilize it on the buccal. Sometimes I can fill from the sides of it. So you need to hold the titanium mesh and move it. And the good thing here, I want you to see the pore size. It's 1.3 millimeter. Huh? It's not a small size. No membrane, nothing of that nature. And here 8 months later, we took an intraoral scan. We did the implant software management to plan the implant digitally. And we went ahead, we opened the flap, and you can see the bone that was built. I can do bone formation. I don't have histology to talk about bone regeneration. And we use the guides to place the 2 implants. And then I always like to add more bone because she's young and there's never enough bone. I add more cortical bone on the buccal, and I covered it with a resorbable membrane, and we closed it up. And then we waited 6 months and we went for the second stage. And I always like when I do second stages, also, you will see I have a book and we'll show you, I'll talk a lot about the soft tissue management around them. And I like to temporize at the same time of the second stage because you can achieve a great scalloping of the tissue. And here at the case that delivered final, and this is how we started. And this is the 4 years follow-up. Actually, she's due to come now. That will be 5 years. We started it in July of 2020, literally during COVID time. And this is also a comparative where we started and she moved to Seattle, but she comes every year once to visit us and to keep an eye on these implants. And this is comparative radiographic. So with that, this is the book that I told you about. You can see all of the kins that I did and so much more. I want to take this opportunity to summarize what we talked about. We reviewed the wound healing. We did the guided bone regeneration that requires the 3 principles: the space, the containment, and the stabilization of the graft, which later that graft can act physiologically either by osteoconductivity alone or osteoconductivity and osteoinductivity, or osteoinductivity alone, or both. And if it's an autogenous, it's osteogenesis. And then the different variety of bone graft sources. And we talked about allograft and recipient side. We'll go through resorption and replacement versus the xenograft and alloplast, which will stay present in the recipient sites. So all of these are the references of all the papers that I mentioned to you. And with that, we have to do a small knowledge check question. And question number one, Wicked Joe 1990, wound healing requires the following: blood clot formation, wound cleansing, tissue formation, tissue modeling and remodeling. Answer is all of the above. Question two, based on Schenk et al. 1994, a successful bone regeneration requires space creation, space stabilization, space maintenance. The answer is all of the above. Question three, what is the value of preserving the organic component in an allograft? Allow remodeling, has inductive capability, has osteogenic capability. It's A and B, allow remodeling, has inductive capability. Question number four, sintering and heat treatment are both thermal processes used in treating xenograft. They both serve one purpose, which is removing organic component into xenograft, preserving organic component into xenograft. C, nothing. D, A and B. The answer is A, removing organic component into xenograft. And lastly, question number five, Scarano et al. 2017 found that sinuses grafted with bovine or ceramic grafting material, an infection around a dental implant spread to of the grafted material in the maxillary antrum. Entirety, partially, none. Answer is A, the entirety of the grafted material in the maxillary antrum. So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time and watching my webinar. I really appreciate it, and I hope it was a good addition to you and you learned something new. This is how we can be in touch in social media, and you're more than welcome to go to my podcast. I would love to have you listening to it and give me your feedback, as well as some of the procedure. I put them on YouTube as a periodontist. You will really enjoy it. And I hope that you will find my book interesting. And with that, I want to thank you and thank the Academy and LifeNet Health for the invitation. And hopefully we'll meet in person one day. Thank you.